The East River Prison in New Jersey greeted the morning of May 23, 2017, with its familiar cadence, a symphony of sounds that had long since woven itself into the fabric of the place. Sirens wailed at precise intervals, their shrill notes cutting through the damp air, while the shuffle of footsteps from countless boots and sneakers reverberated off the cold, unyielding concrete walls. Voices, some sharp with command, others muted with resignation, echoed down the corridors, bouncing between the gray surfaces until they faded into a distant hum. It was a routine as predictable as the sunrise, though the sun itself rarely pierced the thick, barred windows of this fortress of confinement. Nathan Kelly, a 40-year-old corrections officer, stepped into this world at 6:30 a.m., marking the start of his shift with the same precision he brought to every aspect of his life. His sun-bleached hair, once a sandy blonde, now carried streaks of gray at the temples, a testament to years spent under both the open sky and the fluorescent lights of the prison. His frame still bore the broad shoulders and upright posture of the athlete he had been in his youth, though time had softened the edges, leaving him solid rather than sculpted. Dressed in his crisp uniform, the dark fabric pressed to perfection, he moved with a quiet confidence born of 12 years in the system. His badge gleamed faintly on his chest, catching the dim light as he adjusted it with a practiced flick of his fingers. Every motion was deliberate, honed by a decade plus of navigating the rigid structure of East River, where order was not just a preference but a necessity. The air inside the prison hung heavy with moisture, a perpetual dampness that clung to the walls and seeped into the bones of those who dwelled there. It mingled with a sharp tang of disinfectant, a scent that lingered in every corner, as if the building itself were constantly scrubbed to erase the traces of its inhabitants. The corridors stretched out in a maze of gray shadows, their surfaces pitted and worn from years of use, illuminated only by the harsh glow of overhead lights that buzzed faintly with age. Nathan had grown accustomed to this environment, his senses dulled to its peculiarities over time. He no longer flinched at the clang of a distant gate or the sudden shout that might erupt from a cell block. This was his domain, a place where he enforced the rules and maintained the fragile balance between chaos and control. On this particular morning, the prison buzzed with a subtle undercurrent of anticipation. A new inmate was due to arrive, a transfer from another facility upstate. Her file sat on the scratched wooden table in the guardroom, a thin manila folder stamped with the seal of the New Jersey Department of Corrections. Nathan had skimmed it earlier, his hazel eyes scanning the typed lines with the detached efficiency of someone who had read hundreds of such documents. Her name was Emily Wright, 26 years old, sentenced to 8 years for drug distribution. The photograph clipped to the page showed a young woman with sharp cheekbones and a gaze that seemed to linger somewhere beyond the camera, thoughtful and distant. Her record noted a history of petty theft and minor offenses, but nothing in her previous incarceration suggested she'd be a troublemaker. She was, by all accounts, unremarkable in the grand tapestry of East River's population. Another name, another number. The armored van rolled into the yard just after 8 a.m., its engine rumbling as it came to a stop outside the Sallyport. Nathan watched from his post near the entrance to the women's block, his arms crossed casually over his chest. The heavy gates groaned open, admitting the vehicle with a slow, deliberate grind of metal on metal. 2 officers stepped out first, their faces obscured by the brims of their caps, followed by the new arrival. Emily emerged from the van, her wrists bound by steel cuffs that glinted faintly in the overcast light. She wore the standard-issue orange jumpsuit, its color stark against the muted tones of the prison yard. Despite the restraints, there was a quiet energy in her movements, a subtle roll of her shoulders, a measured step that hinted at something unbroken within her. Nathan observed her approach, noting the way she held her head, neither bowed nor defiant, but steady, as if she had already accepted this new chapter, without surrendering to it entirely. He met her at the threshold of the women's block, standing just inside the doorway, where the air grew cooler and the echoes sharper. His voice carried the weight of authority as he recited the rules. Lights out at 10 p.m., no contraband, compliance with all orders. Each word delivered with the same clip precision he used every day. Emily stood before him, her eyes meeting his for a brief moment before dropping to the floor, a gesture that might have been deference or simply disinterest. He handed her off to another guard to process her belongings, a small bag of personal items already searched and cataloged, before directing her to cell 312, a narrow space on the third tier of the block. She disappeared into the labyrinth of the prison, her figure swallowed by the shadows as the steel door clanged shut behind her. The day unfolded in its usual rhythm after her arrival. Nathan moved through his rounds, clipboard in hand, checking locks and logging observations. The women's block hummed with activity, the clatter of trays in the kitchen, the murmur of conversations in the common area, the occasional sharp bark of an order from a fellow officer. By evening, the light outside had faded to a dull gray, casting long shadows through the barred windows. Nathan's final patrol took him past the third tier, his boots thudding softly against the concrete floor. As he passed cell 312, he paused, his gaze drawn to the figure inside. Emily stood near the bars, her hands resting lightly on the metal, her eyes fixed on the sliver of sky visible through the high, narrow window. She didn't move, didn't turn to acknowledge his presence, but there was a stillness in her posture that struck him, a quiet resilience that stood out amid the restless energy of the prison. For a moment he lingered, his clipboard forgotten at his side, caught by something he couldn't quite name. Then he turned away, resuming his rounds, the echo of his footsteps fading into the night. A week passed since Emily Wright's arrival at East River Prison, and in that time, she began to carve out a quiet existence within its confines. She adapted to the rhythms of the institution with a kind of understated efficiency, slipping into her assigned role in the kitchen without fanfare. Each morning, she reported to the cavernous room where stainless steel counters gleamed under flickering lights, and the air carried the mingled scents of boiled potatoes and industrial cleaner. There, she worked alongside a handful of other inmates, her hands moving with a mechanical precision as she peeled carrots or diced onions, her focus fixed on the task rather than the chatter around her. She kept to herself, her presence unobtrusive, her interactions limited to the bare minimum required to navigate the day. In the common areas, she avoided the clusters of women who gathered to trade gossip or barter favors, choosing instead to linger on the edges, her silence a shield against the restless energy of the block. Nathan Kelly, whose duties demanded a constant presence throughout the prison, found his path crossing hers with increasing frequency. At first, these encounters were mere happenstance, fleeting moments woven into the fabric of his routine. He'd catch sight of her in the kitchen during his morning rounds, her figure framed by the steam rising from a pot, her movements steady and deliberate as she sliced vegetables with a dull knife. Later, he'd spot her in the dining hall, seated at the end of a long table, her tray balanced before her as she ate alone, her eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the gray walls. These glimpses were brief, unremarkable in isolation, yet they began to linger in his mind, small threads that tugged at the edges of his awareness. He told himself it was nothing more than professional observation, the kind of vigilance his job required. But there was a quiet pull in those moments that he couldn't entirely dismiss. One afternoon, as Nathan distributed a stack of approved items, letters, hygiene supplies, the occasional permitted trinket, Emily approached him with a request. She stood at the edge of her cell, her hands clasped loosely in front of her, and asked for a book. The prison rules allowed such privileges for inmates in good standing, a small concession to break the monotony of their days. Nathan nodded, noting the request on his clipboard, and later that day returned with a worn paperback he'd pulled from the library cart. It was a tattered collection of Edgar Allan Poe's short stories, its cover creased and its pages yellowed from years of handling. He handed it to her through the bars, his fingers brushing the edge of the book as she took it with a slight dip of her head, a gesture that might have been gratitude or simple acknowledgement. She said nothing more and he moved on, but the exchange lingered with him, a faint ripple in the still waters of his routine. Days later, during a routine inspection of the kitchen, Nathan spotted a scrap of paper tucked beneath a cutting board. He unfolded it, revealing a few lines scrawled in pencil, a fragment of Poe's The Telltale Heart copied in a neat slanting hand. He recognized the words from the book he'd given her, and when he glanced across the room, he saw Emily wiping down a counter, her expression unreadable. Later that evening, As he passed her cell, he paused, holding up the paper. She stepped closer to the bars, her eyes meeting his for a moment, and they exchanged a few brief thoughts about the story, its tension, its darkness, the way it burrowed into the mind. It was a small thing, a fleeting connection, but it marked the beginning of something new. From then on, their encounters grew more frequent, less accidental. He'd linger at her cell during his rounds, his clipboard resting against his hip as she shared her impressions of the tale she'd read, her voice low and measured, her words carrying a sharpness that surprised him. Nathan had spent years cultivating a wall between himself and the inmates, a barrier of professionalism that kept his world orderly and predictable. He'd seen others falter, guards who grew too familiar, who let the lines blur, and he'd prided himself on his discipline, his ability to maintain that distance. But with Emily, that wall began to crack. It wasn't just her restraint, the way she held herself with a quiet dignity that set her apart from the others. It was the rare smiles that flickered across her face when she spoke of a story she liked, brief and unguarded, or the keen intelligence in her observations, cutting through the dull haze of prison life. These qualities gnawed at him, stirring something he hadn't felt in years, a curiosity, a pull that defied the rules he'd lived by. He found himself seeking her out, his steps slowing as he approached her cell, his gaze lingering a moment longer than necessary. Mike Lawson, Nathan's partner on the shift, noticed the change, though he didn't dwell on it. A stocky man with a perpetual squint and a habit of chewing gum, Mike had been at East River nearly as long as Nathan. He'd seen him making more frequent stops in Block B, his clipboard in hand but his attention elsewhere. But he chalked it up to the monotony of their work. Nathan was reliable, steady, too seasoned to let anything slip, or so Mike assumed. He didn't question the extra minutes spent near cell 312, didn't think to connect it to the new inmate who kept her head down and her words few. For him, it was just another day in the grind, another shift to endure until the clock released them. That night, Nathan sat alone in his modest apartment in Jersey City, the hum of the city filtering through the cracked window. The place was sparse, a sagging couch, a small TV on a stand, a kitchen counter cluttered with takeout containers. He leaned back, a beer resting unopened in his hand, and let his thoughts drift to Emily. Her voice echoed in his mind, soft but distinct, recounting the way Poe's words twisted around guilt and madness. He saw her standing at the bars, her silhouette framed by the dim light, and felt a weight settle over him. For years he'd lived with a quiet, steady loneliness, a companion he'd accepted as part of the job, part of himself. But now that solitude pressed harder, its edges sharper, as if her presence had exposed a hollow he'd long ignored. He set the beer aside, untouched, and stared at the ceiling, the faint sound of traffic outside blending with the questions he couldn't yet answer. By mid-July, the bond between Nathan Kelly and Emily Wright had deepened, crossing a threshold that neither had fully anticipated. The air in East River Prison grew thick with the heat of summer, the concrete walls radiating warmth even as the nights stretched long and humid. Nathan's rounds had become a familiar ritual, his boots tracing the same paths through the dimly lit corridors, but now they carried him with a purpose beyond duty. One night, as the clock ticked past midnight, he found himself stepping into the kitchen where Emily lingered after her shift. The space was quiet, the clatter of the day replaced by a stillness broken only by the faint drip of a faucet. Metal tables gleamed faintly under the low glow of a single overhead bulb, casting long shadows across the floor. The air smelled of bleach and damp rags, a sharp contrast to the earthy scent of her presence as she wiped down a counter, her movements slow and deliberate. Their eyes met across the room, a silent exchange that held longer than usual, charged with an unspoken tension. Nathan crossed the space between them, his steps measured, until he stood close enough to feel the warmth radiating from her. He reached out, his hand brushing hers as she set the rag aside, and she didn't pull away. The contact was brief, tentative, but it ignited something within him. Moments later, their lips met, a quick, almost stolen kiss born of impulse rather than plan. It ended as swiftly as it began, leaving them both suspended in the aftermath, their breaths mingling in the quiet. But that first touch unlocked a floodgate, and soon other kisses followed, each one bolder, hungrier, as if they were testing the boundaries of what they'd stumbled into. They sought out hidden corners of the prison, places where the watchful eyes of cameras and guards couldn't reach. The storage room behind the laundry became a refuge, its shelves stacked with folded linens and cleaning supplies, offering a cramped but private sanctuary. There, in the dim light filtering through a cracked vent, they pressed against each other, the rustle of fabric and the creak of the floor beneath them, the only sounds. Another spot emerged in a shadowed stretch of corridor after lights out, where the night shift's patrols were sparse and the darkness cloaked their silhouettes. Even Emily's cell became a haven on rare nights when her bunkmate slept soundly, the thin mattress creaking faintly as they stole moments of closeness behind the bars. Nathan knew every rule he was breaking. Fraternization was a firing offense, a breach of the code he'd upheld for over a decade. But the fear of discovery only sharpened his desire, turning each encounter into a pulse of adrenaline and need. In those stolen hours, they began to share pieces of themselves, peeling back layers that the prison's rigid structure usually kept buried. Emily spoke of her life before East River, her voice soft as she traced the outlines of a childhood spent in Newark. She described narrow streets lined with brick row houses, the hum of traffic blending with the shouts of kids playing stickball, and the small apartment where she'd grown up, its walls papered with dreams she'd once held close. She'd wanted to open a cafe, she told him, a place with mismatched tables and the smell of fresh coffee, where people could sit and forget their troubles. But need had pulled her elsewhere, into a deal gone wrong, a choice that landed her here. Nathan listened, his hands resting on hers, and found himself opening up in return. He spoke of his years in the Army, the dust of desert deployments still vivid in his memory, and the marriage that had crumbled under the weight of his absences. He described the empty evenings in his Jersey City apartment, the silence broken only by the drone of the TV, a life he'd accepted until now. Their connection grew beyond the physical, weaving a thread of trust through the passion that drove them. Each meeting deepened their bond, turning fleeting glances into something solid, something that felt dangerously real. Nathan felt it in the way his chest tightened when he saw her, in the way her presence lingered in his thoughts long after he'd left the prison gates. Mike Lawson, his shift partner, began to notice the shift in him. The stocky guard, with his perpetual gum-chewing and easygoing demeanor, had always relied on Nathan's steady reliability. But now he saw him falter, his focus drifting during briefings, his steps quickening as he headed toward Block B, his hands fidgeting with his clipboard more than usual. Mike's squinting eyes narrowed with suspicion, but he held his tongue, figuring it was fatigue or the summer heat playing tricks on his friend. He'd seen men burn out before. He didn't yet see the fire that was consuming Nathan from within. One humid night, as they lay tangled in the narrow confines of the laundry storage room, Emily rested her head against his chest, her breath warm against his skin. She murmured something about how being with him made her feel alive, a confession that slipped out in the stillness and settled heavily between them. Nathan felt the words sink into him, stirring a realization that had been building for weeks. He was in love with her, fully, irrevocably, in a way that defied the bars and walls that separated their worlds. The thought should have alarmed him, should have sent him retreating to the safety of his old boundaries, but instead it fueled the blaze inside him. He tightened his arm around her, the roughness of her jumpsuit pressing against his uniform, and let himself sink deeper into the moment. The prison slept around them, its corridors quiet save for the distant clang of a gate, but within their hidden space a fire burned, wild, unchecked, and blind to the seeds of ruin it carried. The fragile world Nathan Kelly had built with Emily Wright shattered in the first days of September, as summer's heat gave way to the crisp bite of early autumn. The shift came abruptly, a crack splitting through the foundation of their stolen moments, though the days leading up to it had unfolded with deceptive calm. Nathan had gone in for his annual medical checkup, a routine requirement for all prison staff, on a gray Tuesday morning. He sat in the sterile examination room of the prison's infirmary, the paper crinkling beneath him on the table, while a nurse drew blood with practiced efficiency. The process was familiar. Temperature checked, pulse measured, a few cursory questions about his health, and he left without a second thought, his mind already drifting back to his rounds, to the quiet corners where he might find Emily waiting. The results, he assumed, would be the same as always. A clean bill of health, a formality to file away and forget. A week later, the outcome arrived, delivered not with fanfare but with the quiet weight of a storm cloud rolling in. Nathan was summoned back to the infirmary during a break in his shift, his boots echoing on the linoleum as he crossed the threshold into the small office. The doctor, an older woman with deep lines etched around her eyes and a gaze softened by years of delivering hard news, sat behind a desk cluttered with charts and a flickering computer screen. She gestured for him to sit, her hands folding over a thin folder marked with his name. When she spoke, her voice carried a measured gentleness, but the words landed like blows. HIV positive. She explained that the virus appeared to be a recent infection, likely contracted within the past few months based on the levels in his blood. She urged him to think back, to recall any possible contacts, her tone clinical yet tinged with empathy. Nathan sat motionless, the chair creaking faintly under his weight as the room seemed to shrink around him. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, their hum filling the silence, while her words looped in his mind, sharp and unrelenting. His thoughts spiraled inward, snagging on memories of Emily. Nights in the laundry storage room, her skin warm against his, her breath quickening in the dark. Each recollection twisted into something jagged, a betrayal he hadn't seen coming. Anger rose in his chest, thick and suffocating, clawing its way up his throat until he could barely breathe. He left the infirmary without a word, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his jaw clenched tight enough to ache. The rest of his shift passed in a haze. He moved through the corridors, checked locks, barked orders, but his mind churned with a single focus. By evening, as the prison settled into its nighttime hush, he found himself drawn to Block B, his steps heavy with purpose. He waited until the corridor cleared, the last of the night shift guards disappearing around a corner before stopping at cell 312. Emily stood near the bars, her silhouette outlined by the faint glow of a distant light. She turned as he approached, her eyes catching his, and something in his stare, cold, unyielding, made her pause. She stepped closer, her hands reaching toward the bars, but he didn't wait. He turned on his heel and walked away, her presence a weight he couldn't bear to face. Later that night, driven by a need to confirm what he already suspected, Nathan slipped into the records room. The space was cramped, its walls lined with filing cabinets, the air stale with the scent of dust and old paper. He moved with purpose, his flashlight cutting through the dimness as he rifled through the drawers until he found her file. Emily Wright's medical history lay buried among the pages, a single line typed in stark black ink. HIV positive, diagnosed 3 years prior during her initial incarceration upstate. The date stared back at him, a silent accusation. She had known, had carried this secret through every touch, every kiss, every whispered moment they'd shared. He stood there, the folder trembling slightly in his hands, as the reality settled over him like a shroud. She had known all along, and he had been blind, drawn into her orbit without a hint of the poison she carried. The night stretched on as Nathan returned to his apartment in Jersey City, the drive a blur of headlights and shadowed streets. He entered the small cluttered space, couch sagging in the corner, dishes piled in the sink, and collapsed into a chair, his elbows resting on his knees. Darkness pressed against the windows, broken only by the faint glow of a street lamp outside, casting slanted lines across the floor. He sat there for hours, his fists clenched tight, his knuckles whitening as he stared into the void. Memories of Emily flooded him unbidden. Her laughter in the kitchen, the curve of her shoulder in the storage room, the way she'd looked at him with something like trust. Each image fueled his rage, twisting love into something bitter and sharp. By the time dawn crept through the blinds, painting the room in muted grays, he had made up his mind. She would pay for this, for the life she'd stolen from him with her silence. He wouldn't touch her himself, his hands would stay clean, but East River was a place where debts were settled, where others could be persuaded to act. As he stood, his body stiff from the sleepless night, a plan took shape in his mind, cold and precise, like the autumn wind that rattled the windows. He knew the prison's undercurrents, the unspoken alliances that thrived in its shadows. There were inmates who thrived on power, who could be nudged toward violence with the right incentive. He saw the steps ahead, disabling a camera, planting a rumor, stepping back as others carried out the reckoning. His anger hardened into resolve, a blade sharpened by betrayal, and he left the apartment with a purpose that felt both foreign and inevitable. The New Jersey sky hung low and heavy as he drove back to East River, the chills seeping through his uniform, matching the ice that had settled in his heart. Nathan Kelly moved with a precision that belied the storm raging within him, his actions swift and calculated as the days following his decision unfolded. The plan he had forged in the sleepless hours of that September dawn took root quickly, its pieces falling into place with a cold inevitability. He knew East River Prison's underbelly well. 12 years on the job had taught him where power pooled and how it flowed. In Block D, a cluster of inmates held sway, their influence unspoken but palpable, and at their center stood Laura Hill. She was a woman whose name carried weight, her reputation built on whispered tales of swift, brutal retribution. Tall and wiry, with scars crisscrossing her knuckles like a map of past victories, Laura commanded loyalty through fear, her presence a quiet threat that kept her group in line. Nathan had seen her work before, quick, decisive, leaving no room for doubt. And he knew she'd be the instrument of his vengeance. He didn't approach her directly. That would have been too reckless, too traceable. Instead, he turned to Mike Lawson, his shift partner, whose years in the system had dulled his edges and sharpened his instincts for the prison's hidden games. Mike knew the rhythms of East River, the unspoken deals that kept the peace, and he'd long since learned to look the other way when it suited him. Nathan caught him during a quiet moment in the guardroom, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee and cigarette smoke that clung to Mike's jacket. He dropped a subtle hint. Emily was stirring trouble, a loose thread in Block D's order, someone who needed a lesson. Mike chewed his gum slowly, his squinting eyes narrowing as he processed the words, but he didn't ask questions. A faint nod was all Nathan got, a signal that the message would reach Laura through the tangled web of favors and whispers that thrived behind the bars. Mike's silence was his complicity, and Nathan left it at that, trusting the machinery of the prison to turn in his favor. The setup required careful orchestration, a manipulation of the prison's systems that Nathan executed with the same discipline he'd once applied to upholding them. He knew the northern corridor well, a narrow stretch linking Block D to the showers, lined with aging cameras that flickered on their mounts. On the morning of September 18th, he slipped into the control room during a shift change, when the usual bustle left gaps in oversight. With a few keystrokes, he scheduled a 25-minute blackout for that evening, masking it as a routine maintenance glitch. The guards would see nothing amiss, their screens dark for just long enough. Next, he planted a distraction, a false report of smoke in the East Wing, scribbled on a log sheet and passed to a rookie officer with a shrug. It would draw the night shift's attention away, their boots pounding toward a non-existent fire while the real act played out in the shadows. By late afternoon, the stage was set, each piece aligned with a chilling precision that left no trace back to him. That evening, as the prison settled into its restless quiet, Laura Hill and her crew moved with purpose. They cornered Emily in the kitchen after her shift, their voices low as they spun a tale of a work dispute. Something trivial, a missing tray or a botched task, enough to lure her to the showers without raising alarm. Emily followed, her steps steady but unsuspecting, her mind perhaps still lingering on the stories she'd once shared with Nathan. The shower room was a stark, tiled space, its walls slick with condensation, the air heavy with the scent of mildew and soap. The lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting a pale glow over the scene as Laura and three others closed in. The first blow landed hard, a fist to Emily's jaw, snapping her head back. More followed in a flurry, strikes raining down on her face, her ribs, her stomach, each one delivered with a practiced force that spoke of intent. She stumbled, her knees buckling, and fell to the wet floor. the cold tiles meeting her with a dull thud. Blood seeped from her split lip, swirling into the shallow puddles beneath her, but she didn't cry out. Her hands clenched into fists, her body curling inward, a silent defiance even as the assault continued. Nathan watched from a distance, stationed near the block's exit where the corridor bent out of sight. He stood in the shadows, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his heart hammering against his ribs. The sounds reached him faintly, muffled thuds, the scuffle of feet on tile, a sharp intake of breath, but he didn't move closer. He couldn't see her, not fully, just the vague shapes shifting in the dimness. But he knew what was happening. His pulse raced, a mix of adrenaline and something darker, a satisfaction he'd expected to feel but couldn't quite grasp. When the noise stopped, abrupt and final, he turned away, his boots scuffing the floor as he retreated. Minutes later, a pair of guards on patrol stumbled across Emily. Her crumpled form sprawled against the wall and carried her to the infirmary, their shouts echoing down the halls as they called for a stretcher. Nathan drove home under a sky streaked with clouds, the hum of his old pickup blending with the rush of wind through the cracked window. He entered his apartment, the familiar clutter greeting him, empty beer cans on the coffee table, a jacket slung over a chair, and sank onto the couch. The room was dark, save for the faint glow of a street lamp seeping through the blinds, and he stared into the void, waiting for the relief he'd imagined. He'd pictured this moment, her punishment, his retribution, and thought it would lighten the weight pressing on his chest. But as the minutes ticked by, the heaviness only grew, a leaden ache that settled deep in his bones. He rubbed his hands over his face, the stubble rough against his palms, and tried to summon the anger that had driven him. But it felt distant now, drowned by a quiet, gnawing emptiness. By morning, whispers of the attack had spread through East River, rippling from cell to cell like a current. Inmates traded glances in the dining hall, their voices hushed as they pieced together the night's events. The guards buzzed with their own speculation, some shaking their heads, others shrugging it off as just another prison scuffle. Mike Lawson caught Nathan's eye during the shift change, his gum snapping softly as he studied him. His gaze lingered, heavy with something unspoken, curiosity perhaps, or a flicker of doubt. But he didn't press. He turned back to his clipboard, scribbling a note, and let the moment pass. Nathan stood there, his uniform crisp as ever, his posture rigid, but inside the fire that had fueled his plan flickered and dimmed, leaving only shadows in its wake. Emily Wright lay in the infirmary of East River Prison, her body a map of pain etched in bruises and fractures. The attack had left her in critical condition, her ribs cracked from the force of fists, her skull rattled by a concussion that blurred her senses, and her skin mottled with dark, angry marks that spread across her arms, torso, and legs. The small medical ward, with its peeling paint and antiseptic tang, became her world in the days that followed, its narrow cot holding her fragile form as machines beeped softly in the background. The prison's medical staff worked tirelessly to stabilize her, their hands moving with quiet urgency. Stitches for the gash above her eyebrow, bandages for the cuts, fluids dripping through an IV to keep her alive. For nearly a week, she hovered in a haze of unconsciousness, her chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths, while the doctors monitored her vitals, their faces tight with the strain of keeping death at bay. On the 7th day, her eyes fluttered open, the dim light of the room filtering through her swollen lids, and she returned to the living, though the cost of that return was written across her battered frame. As the medical team ran tests to assess her recovery, they uncovered a revelation that shifted the ground beneath the prison's grim routine. The blood work, processed in a lab off-site and returned in a sealed envelope, showed more than just her injuries. It revealed she was pregnant, roughly 3 months along. The news rippled through the infirmary, a quiet shock that passed from nurse to doctor in hushed tones until it reached the duty physician, a wiry man with graying hair and a perpetually furrowed brow. He scribbled the findings in her chart, his pen scratching against the paper, and then made his way to the guardroom to report it as protocol demanded. Nathan Kelly was there, hunched over a lukewarm cup of coffee, when the doctor approached, his voice low as he relayed the update. Nathan froze, the mug slipping slightly in his grip. the liquid sloshing against the rim. 3 months. The timeline aligned with their stolen nights, a cruel arithmetic that pointed to him as the father. The realization sank into him like a stone, heavy and unyielding, anchoring him to a truth he couldn't escape. Later that day, Nathan found himself drawn to the infirmary, his steps slow and deliberate as he approached the door. He stopped at the threshold, his hand resting on the frame, and peered through the small window set into the wood. Emily lay on the cot, her face a patchwork of purple and yellow bruises, her eyes closed in a fitful sleep. A thin blanket draped over her, rising faintly with each labored breath, and an IV line snaked from her arm to a bag hanging beside her. He stood there motionless, his gaze tracing the damage he'd set in motion. Her swollen jaw, the bandage across her forehead, the fragility of her form against the stark white sheets. Anger surged within him, a familiar heat that had fueled his revenge, but it clashed with a rising tide of guilt, a bitter ache that gnawed at his core. Something else stirred too, a feeling he couldn't name, regret perhaps, or the ghost of what they'd once shared, leaving him caught in a tangle of emotions that refused to settle. The prison launched an investigation into the assault, a formality driven by the severity of Emily's injuries. 2 detectives from the local precinct arrived the next morning, their trench coats damp from a drizzle that had settled over New Jersey. They interviewed Laura Hill and her crew in a cramped room off the main block, their notebooks open as they scribbled details. Laura sat with her arms crossed, her scarred hands resting on the table, her expression a mask of indifference. She claimed it was a simple fight, a flare-up over some petty kitchen dispute, and that Emily had provoked it with a sharp word or a shove. Her accomplices echoed the story, their accounts aligning with a practiced ease. Too neat, too rehearsed. The detectives pressed, but the cameras in the northern corridor had been dark that night, their footage a blank void, and no witnesses stepped forward from the shadows of Block D. The case stalled, its threads unraveling into a dead end, and the officers left with little more than a report that would gather dust in a filing cabinet. Nathan navigated the fallout with a careful detachment, his face a blank slate as questions came his way. The warden called him in once, a gruff man with a smoker's rasp, to confirm his whereabouts during the incident. Nathan answered smoothly, on patrol near Block C, nowhere near the showers. His voice steady, his hands clasped behind his back. Inside, though, he felt the cracks spreading, a slow collapse of the man he'd been. Emily recovered over the next month, her body mending enough to sit up, to eat, to shuffle a few steps with a nurse's aid. She said nothing about the pregnancy or the attack, her lips sealed when the staff prodded, her eyes distant as she stared at the wall. The prison moved her to a solitary cell for her safety, a small windowless box where the silence pressed in, isolating her from the whispers and threats that lingered in Block D. Nathan kept working, his shifts a mechanical march through the days. He walked the corridors, checked logs, stood watch, but his eyes grew hollow, their hazel dulled to a flat gray. His movements lost their old sharpness, becoming rote, as if he were a machine winding down. Evenings found him at his post, a narrow booth overlooking the yard, where he'd first seen Emily months before. He'd stand there, hands in his pockets, staring out at the cracked asphalt and the chain-link fence topped with razor wire. The memory of her arrival played in his mind, her steady gait, her quiet energy, and he wondered how it had spiraled to this. Love had drawn him in, revenge had torn him apart, and now he was left with nothing but a shell, a man hollowed out by his own choices. East River Prison carried on around him, its routines unbroken, its secrets buried in the concrete. Within its walls, a new life grew, fragile and uncertain, its future a question mark hanging in the air as the days stretched into an unyielding quiet.